Welcome to the seminar series on modern artificial intelligence at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. The series has always aimed to bring together faculty, students, and researchers to discuss the most important trends in the world of AI, and that remains true even in the new virtual format necessitated by the pandemic. This is the first presentation of 2021, and I think you'll agree that we are setting the bar very high. I would like to thank Dean Jelena Kovacevic, as well as my own Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, for supporting the series and allowing me to introduce to you a growing list of esteemed speakers, all of whom are world-renowned experts whose research is making an immense impact on the development of new machine learning techniques and technologies. In the process, they are helping to build a better, smarter, more connected world, and we are proud to be bringing them to you. I'm pleased to note that 3 of this year's 4 speakers are women, 2 of them women of color. That seems quite fitting here at NYU Tandon, a school very much dedicated to advancing diversity and inclusion in the STEM fields. In that same spirit of inclusion, we are being joined today by a group of GEM fellows, extremely talented young scientists who come from underrepresented and minority groups. We are thrilled to have you in the seminar audience. I'm equally excited that students from Brooklyn Technical High School and the all-girls Hewitt School are joining us as well. Keeping in mind the motto, "It takes a spark to ignite a fire," we hope to motivate people your age to choose career paths in STEM. So we are very happy to welcome you to our seminar family. We are kicking off this year's series with a researcher who embodies the idea of using AI and technology to better society. In fact, it was just last year that she won the Canadian Governor-General's Innovation Award for her leadership in the innovative applications of AI and machine learning to improve the lives of people impacted by severe mobility impairments and diseases like epilepsy. So it gives me great pleasure to tell you a little bit about Joelle Pineau before turning things over to her. Joelle holds an undergraduate degree in engineering from the University of Waterloo and master's and doctoral degrees in robotics from Carnegie Mellon University. She is currently the co-managing director of Facebook AI Research, where she oversees the Montreal, Seattle, Pittsburgh, and Menlo Park labs. Additionally, she is a faculty member at Mila, a Quebec-based community of more than 500 researchers specializing in using machine learning for social good, as well as an associate professor and William Dawson Scholar at the School of Computer Science at McGill University, where she co-directs the Reasoning and Learning Lab. She has been celebrated for her development of algorithms to handle a special set of mathematical problems known as partially observable Markov decision processes, and has applied her research to the challenge of developing personalized and robot-assisted health assistants, including an intelligent robotic wheelchair. She has also explored the application of reinforcement learning techniques in the treatment of cancer, specifically to improve adaptive radiation dosage. Earlier in her career, she pioneered reinforcement learning techniques to optimize neurostimulation technology to reduce epileptic seizures and discovered new methods of learning adaptive pharmacological treatment strategies for mental health conditions such as depression and schizophrenia. It would take much longer than I have to list Joelle's many honors and fellowships, and I know we are all eager to hear her presentation, which is entitled Building Reproducible, Reusable, and Robust Deep Reinforcement Learning Systems. It is an important topic for anyone interested in using machine learning in real-world applications. So without further ado, I give you Joelle Pineau.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for the warm introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to join a group of researchers or people who are curious about research and share with you some of the work that we've been doing. The work I will present today is work that's mostly done with students and colleagues at McGill University and at Mila, though I continue to be inspired and nourished also by my colleagues at Facebook AI Research. just get started moving the slides. I think, many of us have been infected by this enthusiasm for AI, and I will not take a long time just to remind you of the vast possibilities of the technologies of AI. We've seen a lot of promises, whether it be for, bringing in autonomous vehicles that will disengorge our cities from transit, helping our cities be much smarter in terms of collecting information that can improve the quality of our lives, helping us at an individual level, whether it's, assistance answering some questions or with improved medical care. Throughout this plethora of different applications, really comes a desire to improve our societies, improve people's lives through the use of technology. But in doing that, I think we have a hard responsibility to make sure that the technology that we develop and the research that we produce is really at the highest level in terms of quality, such that we can meet these promises. And so a lot of my work is really motivated both by a desire to exploit and develop AI techniques that can realize these promises, but to do so in a way that I think has the highest standards in terms of scientific responsibility. And so that is why this theme of reproducibility. One might wonder, why did I pick what I call my 3 R's: reproducibility, reusability, and robustness? And I think this quote that comes from the National Science Foundation sort of ties these 3 ideas in a way that is quite motivating. And so this notion of reproducibility really refers to the ability for a researcher to duplicate the results of a prior study. And we want to make sure the duplication is done using the same material as were used by the original investigator. And the reason we care so much about reproducibility is because in many ways it's a minimum necessary condition for funding to be believable and informative. And as researchers, in many cases, we take a problem, we analyze it, we make some progress, and we, present a publication or a talk that speaks to the results of our work. But we don't want the research to stop at the paper or at the talk. We want the research to take on a life of its own and really start changing technology, changing the lives of people. And so if we don't meet this very high standard, what I'm calling the standard of scientific responsibility in terms of reproducibility, reusability, and robustness, we're really not living up to the expectations that we should have of ourselves. And so I'm just getting my slides organized a little bit. For those of you who are maybe a little bit less familiar with machine learning, let me take a small example to sort of bring you along to the rest of this talk. What do I mean by reproducibility specifically in machine learning? So let's take, for example, an area of AI called computer vision. In many ways in computer vision, the goal is to take an image. So we have an image of a cat. We know the internet is full of images and videos of cats. So we take one of these images. The machine understands this as a set of numbers that represent the intensity and color value of the pixels in the image. And from this interpretation of the image, the goal is to train a function that will accurately predict the content of that image. And so in this case, we use a neural network. It's a very complicated function. And inside of that function, through the exposure to many, many, many images, it learns how to analyze the pixels and make the right prediction for different types of objects. And so by the time the research is done in a lab, usually the result will look something like this, right? There'll be some graphs that says, depending on the amount of training or the amount of data that my function has seen, in this case, my ResNet function has seen, I can see that the training error, so the number of error the algorithm makes on the images in the training set, so the set from which it's learning, that error keeps on going down. And depending if I use 20 layers, so that's like 20 of these little boxes over here, or 56 layers, I might get different performance. That performance is usually also tested on a separate test set. So these are some images we've put aside to see how well we're doing. We don't want to overfit, so learn only on the data we've trained on and not be able to transfer. So to put this in really concrete terms for people who are less familiar with machine learning, right? The training error would be, let's say you're training how to, maybe drive a bicycle. So you're trying to ride your bicycle, and the test error is like, how well can you do if suddenly you're on a different bicycle and you decide to do that. So it's going to be a little bit harder, but hopefully not too much if you learn very well. So this is the notion that we're really trying to figure out here. And so when I talk about reproducibility in this case, what I mean is the top box over here. I mean that if someone else was to take the same data that you've used in your study, in your paper, and the same code and analysis tools, that you would get the same result. And if in doing that, you get the same result, then we can have an evidence that the research is reproducible. And I want to distinguish this slightly from other concepts that are also used in the literature, the notion of replicable research, where you might take the same code and analysis, but you're going to go and collect entirely different data to see if your methods are also useful. And the notion of robustness, where in that case you use the same data, but you might re-implement the code or change the analysis a bit and see if the results hold. In the end, what we really strive for as researcher is generalization. So generalizable results mean that even if I switch the data, switch the code and the analysis, the conclusion is still the same, the performance is the same. So that's definitely where we want to be going in terms of generalizable research. But for now, I'm focusing mostly on having high standards of reproducibility because it's the first step towards generalizable research. The call to attention for reproducibility has come out across several scientific domains, not just machine learning. There's been a discussion of the crisis of reproducibility across the sciences. Psychology has had to contend with this. Chemistry, biology, physics are all also speaking about this notion of a reproducibility crisis. One of the nicer work on this topic was produced recently, a couple of years ago, by Edward Raff, who looked at 255 papers from the 1980s to as late as 2017 and looked at whether the papers were reproducible. And what's beautiful about his analysis is he specifically looked at content in the paper, different items, and tried to see what was the link, how much did that item, what he calls a feature, predict whether or not the code was reproducible. And so what I've reproduced here is sort of the 5 top factors, right? One of them is, did we have access to pseudocode? So an implementation or a precise description of the implementation. Did we have access to the hyperparameters? And so these are, the details such as the number of building blocks in my neural network. Was the paper mostly readable in terms of equations and tables? Were they well defined and easy to understand? How much computation is needed for the work? There's some work that require a huge amount, many months of thousands of machines to do, which of course is much harder. And number 5, really, what was the topic of the paper? So some areas tend to have a better record in that respect. The one thing I'm not listing here, but if you're looking at the table on the right, you're also noticing a little line that says authors reply. So in some cases, if the authors collaborate, the authors of the original study collaborated with the people doing the reproducibility study, there was a much higher chance that we were able to achieve reproducibility of that work. So communication and collaboration are sort of the human ingredient that makes a lot of this possible. In my own subfield, I actually work in a subdiscipline of AI called reinforcement learning. The notion of reinforcement learning dates back several decades from the field of psychology. And it's really this idea of being able to train agents, human, animal, or even some robot agents, train the agents to accomplish a behavior. So in this case, we have a surprisingly so, there's been a results recently showing that you could actually train this chicken to just peck on the pink dot, and somehow it learns through reinforcement. So in this case, it's given a reward. You see the food pellet being offered every time the chicken pecks on the pink circle. And so it's really learning that one leads to reward versus the other one. And similarly, you can train a rat to navigate a maze and find its way outside the maze. And so reinforcement learning is sort of a codification of that for computers and robots, whereby we want to train these agents to exhibit actions that maximize a particular reward. And the agent observes some perceptions, so some information from the world. It observes a reward when it does a good action, and it has to choose its actions such as to maximize the obtention of reward. And so this has been codified with a set of mathematical models and algorithms over the years, and it's been used in many different applications. Possibly the applications that have gotten the most visibility for the international community is the use of reinforcement learning to build a champion Go player, the AlphaGo system built by Google DeepMind a few years ago, which was actually able to beat the best human players at this very complicated game. And most recently, it was also used in a system called Libratis to play poker. And here again, showing ability to defeat some human experts at this game through reinforcement learning. So in that case, the reward is really just to win the game. And beyond these two applications, there's actually a number of other uses of reinforcement learning that are being explored. I have a long list here. This is extracted from papers of the recent years. In each of these cases, there's active research in using reinforcement learning framework to optimize the behavior of a computer or a robot to make progress on these important problems. So whether it's, managing some crops, managing some forest fires, controlling a prosthetic arm for people with disabilities, autonomous driving, energy trading, and so on and so forth. I think you will agree with me, even if you don't care all that much about poker or about Go, that these other applications that I'm listing here have an incredible potential in terms of individuals and society. And it's important that we really figure out how to apply RL to these in a responsible and robust way. In my own work, I've actually looked mostly at the application of reinforcement learning in healthcare. So I'll mention a few projects today, not all of them because we have a short time together, but at least to give you a taste of how we apply reinforcement learning in this project, and then tie this back to this question of reproducibility, reusability, and robustness, which I think is absolutely key. So let me speak briefly of this project. This was a few years ago. We started a new collaboration with researchers in neuroscience at McGill University. These researchers were already studying mechanisms to apply neurostimulation to the brain of patients with epilepsy. So in a neurostimulation system, you have electrodes that are placed inside the brain. Sometimes it's surface, sometimes it's depth electrodes. These electrodes deliver an electrical signal that is activated by the device, and that electrical signal, when it hits the neural system, actually is dispersed by the neurons through their natural activation mechanisms. And the reason this is an effective treatment for epilepsy is, in fact, because by injecting neural activity at times in the brain, you sort of disable the brain's ability to recruit all the neurons and start seizing together. And when you have an epileptic event, what happens is, in fact, that all these neurons are sort of suddenly recruited into firing in a synchronous manner. So the electrical signal here acts as a disruptor to that synchronization mechanism in the brain. And so the hypothesis was that we already knew that neurostimulation could be effective. Could we use reinforcement learning to make it more effective? So to abort more seizure, abort them earlier on, do so with fewer stimulation, because the amount of stimulation can have a damaging effect on the brain tissue. And so this is what the input looks like into our AI system. This is the reading from one electrode. It's usually recorded at quite high frequency, several hundred hertz. Over time, you see that as a continuous signal. And here we have what we call these interictal spikes. These are usually indicators that a seizure is upcoming. So the good thing here is that there is information in the signal that our computer algorithms can use to predict when to increase the stimulation. This particular example, there's no stimulation at all. And so at some point, the deflection occurs. There's an ictal event, or so in an epileptic seizure that happens over here. That lasts a few seconds, maybe 20, 30 seconds. And then after that, there's what we call the post-ictal, so the after seizure phase, where the brain slowly recovers a normal pattern, though still with the interictal spikes. So if you had a brain that wasn't susceptible to epilepsy, you would not have these interictal spikes. You would not have this ictal event. You would have much more regular behavior. Here's what happens when you apply neurostimulation, but at a fixed interval. So in this case, every second we're hitting the brain with a small discharge of the neurostimulator. This does not use reinforcement learning. This is what we call the agnostic version. So this is really the control condition. And though you see these large deflection, that's actually like, that's the recording electrode seeing the input signal. So that's not actually natural in the brain, but you see that there's no particular deflection that comes from that. And so this external perturbation is actually a good way to change the dynamics such that you don't have these hyperexcitable events. Now, our hypothesis was that with adaptive neurostimulation, so if we feed the recording electrode into a computer, we can actually select actions that are perhaps not evenly distributed, that adapt in real time to the signal, and in doing so can both minimize the number of seizures, minimize their duration, and minimize the overall amount of stimulation delivered. All the experiments we did in this project are an in vitro model of epilepsy. So you take a slice from the brain of a rat and put it in a dish and induce epilepsy by the injection of some chemicals. And you both record and you stimulate directly in that tissue. So those brain slices last on the order of a few hours, maybe 2 or 3 hours, through which we can do some recording, some learning. It's relatively little data compared to other models of machine learning. And so in this particular project, I would say we spent about 6 months collecting the initial data set. When I say n equals 8, that means we had 8 different slices from which we recorded. As I mentioned, from each of these slices, we get 2, 3, maybe 4 hours of recording. And through that period, we alternate between different protocols of simulation, all of them non-intelligent, non-RL. So during training, we're either doing no stimulation at all, that's the control condition, or we stimulate at 0.1 hertz. So every 10 seconds, we deliver a discharge, or we stop stimulating again, or every 0.2 hertz, 0.5, and 1 hertz. So these are all the training conditions. There's no AI during that first phase. It took us about 6 months to record that initial data set. Then we had about 6 months in our own lab. They sent us the data. We trained a learning algorithm using a batch machine learning algorithm. And after the end of that 6 months, we sort of emerged, carried the laptop back into the neuroscience lab and tried to see how well did we do? How well does our reinforcement learning strategy do in terms of both stunting the seizures and the amount of stimulation it uses? Now, what's interesting to mention is that this validation phase, just the test phase, at this point, we're not learning, training, anything, took 2 years to do. And we tested on 11 slices. We actually had ran 12, but one of them, the slice was not viable. So we couldn't induce the epileptic seizure properly. So 11 slices came into the testing set. It takes 2 years. And so if I go back to this notion of doing research that is reproducible, robust, this is where I'm coming from, right? It's not a couple hours of running in experiments while I'm sleeping overnight and I show up in the morning and the results are there. This is sort of 2 months of me and my students just crossing our fingers that we learn the right thing with our algorithm and that when we're going to test it, we're actually going to see good performance. And indeed, in this case, I'm not spending a lot of the time on the details, but if you see in panel B, what we're showing here is that the adaptive stimulation over here is doing as well as the 1 hertz strategy, but up here we show that we're actually using less stimulation to do that. So in this model, already the 1 hertz was essentially reducing all of the seizures, and it's good that we could learn a protocol that did that while using fewer seizures. So just based on this example, if I go back to sort of the bigger picture, sort of pop out of that project for a second, right, there's really, again, this notion that AI could be made faster, cheaper, if personalized, perhaps even more accessible, accurate. But the question I have to ask is, how do we reliably achieve this? And that we're not just making promises, but we're actually building solutions that can be taken out of the lab and all the way to the patients to realize this. So that's been what's been motivating me in several of the follow-up projects. In many cases, when we start one of these projects, this project that I described was started around 2010, but we've started many more since then. And what I'm showing you here is the number of papers in reinforcement learning that are published in the literature. Very, very few of these papers tackle real world problems. Most of them do all of their evaluation work in simulation. And what really matters is probably the area under the curve over here. So if I'm trying, if I show up today and I'm trying to solve a new problem with reinforcement learning, I have these thousands and thousands of papers to consider and from which to pick my methodology. Now, the challenge, as you saw, right, I'm probably just going to get one try of doing this, or at least, one try every few years of doing this. So I better be very sure when reading a paper that the method as described is reliable and I can trust the results that are in this paper to apply them onto my problem. And in this case, because most of the models in the literature are tested in simulation, they have access to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of trials to train. The types of observation that they get is quite different. In my case, I have an animal model of epilepsy. I'm not yet doing this work with patients. So it's still a model of epilepsy, but the cost of running that model is much, much greater. The time of running the experiments is much longer. And so whatever works in models in the RL literature may be quite different from what will work in an animal model of epilepsy. And still further, going from this animal model of epilepsy to real world system also involves a gap in terms of complexity and the risk of doing these experiences. So in practice, it's really important to consider these gaps when selecting the right method to solve a problem. Let me dig a little bit more into some of these methods. I didn't really describe how we were doing this work. So let me dig into one family. And to be completely transparent with you, this isn't actually the model we used for doing the epilepsy project, which was done a few years before. But if I was to redo this work today, this is the family of methods I would consider. And so I'm going to focus my analysis here to be just a little bit more up to date with the literature. So there's a family of these reinforcement learning that we call policy gradient algorithms. And even if you don't have a deep knowledge of machine learning, it's not very complicated. There's a state information that gets fed in. So that can be an image. It can be the recording from one of my electrodes. That gets fed into a neural network. So neural network is a very complicated function that is going to learn to predict when to apply each action. So when to stimulate, when to hold off. And through this policy, we can actually train the parameters of my neural network. And so what I'm showing here is a bit of a cartoon version of policy gradient algorithms, because in fact, there's different derivations of this in this family of algorithms, and they each have their little secret sauce to make the learning more efficient. And so I'm listing 4 of these algorithms here that have been particularly popular, each of them used hundreds, if not thousands of times in the literature. When we started looking at these algorithms, we had some new applications into mind. Most of the results for these algorithms are on simulation. So here I'm showing the very popular Majoko simulator. It's a task called the half cheetah because it's a cartoon version of a cheetah that's sort of sliced in half. So you just get one side. I don't know if it's the left side or the right side, but you get half of the cheetah. And the goal is to learn to run for this cheetah. So initially, the legs are not coordinated. It's not running very well. And when we trained the half cheetah in simulation with the 4 algorithms I listed on the previous page, we actually saw quite a bit of difference between them. And it's not so important to tell you which algorithm is which. The point is, if you look at the results, you would be tempted to conclude that the red algorithm is actually much better at training the cheetah than the others. And so the question I would have as someone who's interested in real world application in the medical domain is, should I just go ahead and take the red algorithm? Because the literature sure seems to show that this red algorithm is doing better than the other. Fortunately, I'm a little bit persistent when I ask these questions. So I start looking at a few other domains. One of them is a hopper. So this device learns to kind of hop on the spot. Another one is kind of a swimmer. And what we see is that in the hopper environment, the blue algorithm does a lot better. And similarly in the swimmer environment, but in hopper, there's very small variance. In swimmer, there's very large variance. In both those cases, suddenly the red algorithm is terrible. And I have to keep in mind the fact that my half cheetah is a lot more similar to my hopper than either of them is to, you know, a brain, whether that of a human or an in vitro rat model. And so it's very hard to conclude from these, what should I be doing? Which algorithm should I be using for my practical applications? At that point, we started digging in a little bit more with some of my students, asking some questions. How can we really be highly confident of which methods are better than the others? We started thinking maybe we didn't get the right implementation for all of these. There's a wonderful availability of open source implementation machine learning. I think that's one of the best features of our community. At the same time, if that code is coming out without proper documentation and proper validation, it can be a little bit confusing to know what to use when. So we looked specifically at the TRPO algorithm. We found 3 different code bases that we could leverage from open source, and we compare them. And you quickly see the difference between these implementations actually bigger than perhaps the difference with other algorithms. We thought maybe TRPO is very unstable. So we looked at DDPG, which is another of the 4 algorithms, and we see the same thing. The performance in terms of average return actually varies a lot depending on which code base you use. And consistently we found this. And I think, you know, those of you who are on the call today and who've done a lot of experimentation in machine learning perhaps are not surprised at all by this result. There are many factors that can influence this. I talked to you early in the talk about the work of Edward Ruff, and, you know, some of the main factors that influence reproducibility were what he called hyperparameters. And so in this case, you know, the network, the structure of the neural network for policy search, depending on number of layers, number of neurons, is clearly influencing the results significantly. The choice of activation unit also influencing the results, though perhaps less so. Keep on looking at that. You know, we start varying the scaling of the reward, whether or not we use normalization at each layer of a neural network. And again, huge variance in the results through each of these changes. And so one of the challenges that comes here is when you're comparing several methods, maybe you have a new algorithm you're comparing to previous algorithms, it is hard to have the same level of motivation to find the best parameters for all of the algorithms. Usually you have sort of your pet algorithm that you've developed, and there's sort of a natural phenomenon in humans that, you know, the amount of motivation determines the persistence of the scientist. And we're seeing that really concretely in some of the papers published across the literature. And so the other problem here is that the number of sources of variation when you run experiments in deep learning is astronomical. And so, you know, you could think of a huge number of variants in terms of how the data was acquired, pre-processed, the architecture we've talked about, activation, initial weights, learning rates, all of these different factors of variation, which can be declined in so many ways, make it very hard both to document a proper process, but also to find which setting is the best for a particular algorithm and for a particular application. And so we looked at several papers in reinforcement learning across the literature published at top conferences to see how well do they document these factors. So we tried in a sense to, you know, have an analogy to Edward's Ruff's study, but in this case specifically for papers in reinforcement learning to help guide us in our own work. And so what we found is that a good number of papers had experiments. That was our selection criteria. We wanted papers that have experiments. So 100 of the papers did have that. Most papers use neural network. Again, we were looking at sort of a class of papers that were most relevant to our research. About 90% of them describe the hyperparameters for their proposed algorithm. Unfortunately, only 60% of them describe the hyperparameters for the other algorithms they were comparing to. We had a link to code in about 55% of papers. 20% described how they were choosing the hyperparameter. 10% of them perform evaluation on a holdout test set, so not the same data. And finally, only 5% of them applied significant testing to really show whether the results of their proposed algorithm versus the baseline was statistically significant. So you see, there's still a lot of space for improvement in terms of the scientific methodology from these papers. So at this point, I don't want to be just the critic in the room and the bearer of bad news. I do feel a responsibility to try to support the field in doing better, as I do with my own work and my own students. And so we started looking for different solution methods, not to just be always calling the problems, to be in constructive mode. There's no denying that machine learning systems are very complex. There's the data, there's the compute, there's who's doing the work, there's what knowledge comes in, who's doing it, and so on. And so it's a complex interface of different components. But it's not the same. It's not the only systems that are that complex. We've learned how to fly planes. We fly less right now, but we've learned to fly planes, which are complicated engines with lots of people that land in airports all over the world with different systems, and we do that remarkably reliably. We've also are doing intricate, surgery across all sorts of conditions, and those two fields have developed some very simple tools to help them in terms of reliability. And one of the tools that has been proven through study to really improve reliability and quality in both of these domains is the use of a simple checklist. And so in some of our work, we actually proposed what we call the ML reproducibility checklist, which is designed to help people really make sure when they write a paper to have all these different details that are absolutely key to reproduce the work. And so there's a section of the checklist that talks about the models and the algorithms that are presented. There's a section of the checklists that applies to theoretical claims. There's a section that is for the data sets that you might be using. There's a section for the code. So any code that comes with the work, here are the items that you should include: the dependencies, the training code, the evaluation code, the pre-trained model, and a README file, 5 elements. We'll get back to those in a minute. And for the experimental results, the range of hyperparameter considered, how you selected them, the number of training and evaluation run, specific measure of statistics, your metrics, and so on. And so this checklist has now been used quite widely in the literature to help improve the reproducibility of machine learning results. It's interesting that some sections of the checklist, in particular this section on code, we actually used information and studies to justify why include these specific 5 elements. We partnered with a group called Papers with Code. This group, Papers with Code, actually hosts code for machine learning. It hosts some benchmarks and really tracks the performance of different algorithms. And the little study they performed for this is to look at, if you look at, in this case, 800 plus GitHub repository that were submitted with NeurIPS 2019 papers, the 5 items that I mentioned previously, for the papers that had none of them, so 0 ticks, then they had a median of 1.5 GitHub stars. That's not very good. That means nobody is really using your code. For those repositories that had all 5 items ticked, they had a median of almost 200 GitHub stars. And this was done, less than a year after the papers were released. We can imagine that the GitHub stars for most of these have continued to climb much, much faster. And so it's on the basis of this study, actually, that we selected those 5 items. When we did the study, we had many more items we considered, but those are the 5 that were most predictive of GitHub stars, which we take as a proxy for quality of the code. So we're using continuously new information to update the checklist and improve and sort of zoom in on the pieces that are most important to improve the quality of the work. This particular checklist is part of a larger program on reproducibility, which we've deployed at the NeurIPS conference, one of the major conferences in machine learning over the last 2 years. So you can read all about it if you're interested. In addition to the checklist, we've also organized several iterations now of what we call the ML reproducibility challenge. So we take a set of papers accepted at a conference and we invite people from across the community. Maybe some of you in the audience today participated already. If not, the challenge is ongoing. So please look for the ML reproducibility challenge. It's great for a hackathon event or for anyone looking for a course project, for a machine learning course, end of semester project. You can grab a paper from any of these top conferences listed here. Over the years, we've increased the number of conferences we cover. You claim a paper and you essentially do the reproducibility study. So you try to reproduce the work in the paper. You write a report about it, you submit your report, and once a year we select the best reports that were submitted and we put them through peer review and we publish a special issue in the journal Rescience. And so this is something that's ongoing. If you're interested, we have a paper on arXiv that describes in a lot of detail the reproducibility program that was deployed at NeurIPS 2019, and it's quite similar to the one we used in 2020, and which we're discussing for 2021 also. So just like a quick summary of where we're at, right? Where we were in 2018 when we did our study with those 50 RL papers, and where we are now as a community. There's been a lot of changes happening across the community. One of them is a code submission policy at most conferences now. The second one is if you go onto arXiv now and you want to submit a paper to arXiv, there's actually a tab where you can submit a link to your code. This is new, just launched this fall. Very, very exciting to see that there's an ability to integrate that link natively in arXiv. And it was so successful, we started piloting it with machine learning, but soon after, all these other scientific communities asked for it. So if you're submitting a paper to physics or chemistry or so on, you can also actually submit code. There's a lot more tooling. I didn't discuss tooling a lot, but there's a lot of tooling that can make it very easy to sort of package your code and all dependencies for rerunning your experiments in a way that you can share with other people. There's the ML reproducibility checklist and challenge and the Journal of Rescience, which I described. And so I think, you know, this call to participate and to innovate in terms of reproducibility has received a lot of support from the community. And I'm really, really thankful to see that there's so many people across the community that are committed to improving this. The last thing I'll talk about is an innovative idea, which we're more starting to think about, but hasn't been deployed yet, is this idea of pre-registration. In a lot of the sciences, it has now become practice to pre-register your study before running it. So you will write in a lot of detail, what is your scientific procedure? It will get vetted perhaps by a committee, it will be stored. And so at the end, you go and you run your study, but you're accountable for sharing back the results, whether they're true, whether they're false. And so the idea is it helps track results, not just positive results, but it helps track all results so that we're not stuck sort of in a dead end rerunning experiments that have negative results. And it also holds people accountable for the set of experiments that they tried, so that we can get some reliable statistical information. So there's some people who have sort of discussed whether that's a good idea for machine learning. There's a few things that make this a little bit difficult, specifically for machine learning. On the one hand, you know, it's great that you get a explicit and detailed record of the experimental methodology, and you can get some peer feedback earlier on, not just at the very end when you send your paper for peer review. It does tend to give a more reliable measurement of performance and generalization, which I think is absolutely important. In terms of the negatives, you know, it creates a two-stage review process, and already our review process are quite burdened. So it can slow down the production of results. There's a difficulty of just at the human level, ensuring that the results that are submitted for pre-registration were not previously generated, and you're genuinely just registering your study. And it's also not a great model when you're really doing much more exploratory work, when you just want to understand a phenomenon rather than conclude something. And so we're still playing with this idea. We'll see what comes of it, but it's something to consider in your own research if you would like to do it. I will say in our case, we ran one project. We didn't officially do a pre-registration of it, but we sort of implicitly set it up that way. This particular project was with colleagues at one of the Montreal General Hospital, who are specialists in organ transplant. And they were specifically looking at the transplantation of kidneys and trying to see if they could do a better matching system, better between the donor and the recipient of these organs. These organs are incredibly precious. And so you really want to make sure that that match is the right one. So if you have a set of features describing the donor and the recipient, you can possibly, the question was, can we do better in terms of matching them together? In this case, we had a very, very small data set, only 75 patients. And I was very worried about our ability to do results that would generalize well with such a small data set, but we agreed to give it a try. But from day one, as soon as we received the data from our clinical partners, I took a third of the data, 25 of the patient, and I just locked it up. I didn't give it to the students working on the project. We didn't look at it at all. We just split it off and decided to do all of our training validation, all of this on the 50 remaining cases. And we agreed together with our clinical partner that we would go all the way to writing the paper. If the results seem positive on this set of 50, we would go all the way to writing the paper with the tables in there and everything, the graphs. And at that point only would we pull out the held out test set, rerun the analysis on that test set, and then decide whether the results held up or not. And so we apply the ML methods, get the data clean and prepare, train the model and so on. But we wrote the paper, in this case, the student, wrote it up, and we thought we had some positive effects. We were able to improve the matching between the donor and the recipient compared to the methods they were using. They already had a strategy for matching donor to recipient, but it was based on very few features, gender, age, certain biological characteristics, and so on. And just that little bit of information was used to do the matching, and we were using machine learning to do a more sophisticated model of matching. And we thought we had promising results enough, so we wrote the paper, and then we pulled out the data. Very excited to see. And unfortunately, the results did not hold up. And so, we had a whole pipeline of work, a whole model train, code was ready to go out, paper was, but the results did not prove to generalize to the test set, to extend to that test set. And so it was quite disappointing. At the same time, it's something that we had built into the methodology from day one. We had agreement from everyone involved that this is how we were going to proceed. We had been very clear about that from the beginning. And so we had strong commitment to produce, to continue that way. At that point, you have a few choices. You can get more data, you can get a lot more data, but these are organ transplant patients. There's fortunately relatively few of them. We could try a different model, but that would require more data too. And so in practice, it happened here, as it does sometimes. Many of us moved on to another project. And if at some point my colleagues call back a few years down the line, they have more data, we may revisit the project. More recently, and I'm about to close, so if you have some questions, prepare them, maybe put them on the chat or think about them, and we'll have a few minutes for questions after. We have pivoted to working with partners both in Montreal and in New York on analysis of COVID-19 patient data. And our goal here is really to improve the tracking or the prediction of patient stages, try to use machine learning models to figure out who will require intubation, ICU admission, and who may not survive their infection. And so it's been a fascinating project because we're moving very, very fast. The amount of time we have to analyze the data is very, very short. The sense of urgency is definitely there. And so we have this, always this trade-off between doing things very quickly, building the models, using the prediction, but really trying to use very, very responsible approach and scientifically grounded in good methods. And so I'm not going to share some of the results of this today, but just say this is the kind of setting where you're really tested to sort of stick to a proper scientific methodology. We have unfortunately seen too many sort of false hopes being released in the scientific community about methods that appeared really promising. And once you sort of increase your cohort size and so on, actually the effects don't hold. And so it's just kind of a reminder that even in times of crisis and emergency, most of the time a proper scientific method and strong commitment to using it still pays off. And we've had a few positive results where we feel we've been able to use a good methodology and still produce this. And in this case, the fact that we're working both with New York collaborators and collaborators in Montreal sort of allows us some look at whether we can replicate this study. So we're doing some projects where we train on some data with New York patients, and then we take the model and we just apply it on data from Montreal patients. And in this case, some of the ways in which the hospital systems are set up, the patients are treated, even the approaches to the disease are a little bit different. So it gives us pretty good confidence in terms of reproducibility through that more extended partnership. Let me close on this. I haven't spoken very much about some aspects that I think are incredibly important, and that is how to think of the broader ethical and social issues in AI. And unfortunately, I won't today, but I just want to call your attention that what I talked about today was really about scientific responsibility. I think it is incredibly important, but it is not the end of the road. And I do believe quite strongly that as researchers, yes, our first duty is in terms of scientific responsibility, but we also at some point have to broaden this to social responsibility. And so this is an area that, I'm going to get more and more invested in over the next few years, and hopefully I have a little bit more substance to share with you, maybe on a subsequent visit. With that, let me just close and thank all my collaborators. I'm sure you realize that. And there's a team of fantastic other researchers working with me on these problems. And so here are some of them that I certainly want to acknowledge and thank. And with this, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Yes, so there is a question from the audience. So you mentioned that you are able to find GitHub repos and give them 1 to 5 ticks in your assessment framework. But their question is, the provided repos are different. So how objective and reliable is your ticking strategy?
You cut off for just 1 minute. So you said the question is how reliable it is, but right before that.
Oh, sorry. So their question is their GitHub repos are very different. So how objective and is your teaching strategy?
Yeah, whether the strategy itself is generalizable. In this case, we specifically looked at a batch of papers that were associated, GitHub repos that were associated with accepted NeurIPS papers. And so that's certainly like a certain type of models and a certain style of programming. So I would not say that it's completely generalizable for all sorts of GitHub repos at this stage. We were doing the study to drive the design of the machine learning checklist, which was then going to be used for NeurIPS the subsequent years. So, in terms of having the same train and test distribution, it seemed fair, but I wouldn't yet make some claims that it's useful for GitHub repos in more broadly. I think there's a lot of interesting study that can be done of that nature. Now, the papers with Code team with whom we did this now house papers and code from many other disciplines, not just machine learning. So they're probably in a position to start doing some of that work and start answering some of these questions.
Yes, that's a great answer. And there is a following question. So how can we balance reproducibility with paper submission page limits? Is using the appendix for reproducibility details an acceptable practice, or adding all the details on the GitHub repo?
Yeah, at this stage, I'm not going to be too fussy about how you do it as long as you do it. I do think the appendix is a great place for doing this, but it depends on the level of details. And so sometimes, there's some things that are better fed directly into the GitHub repo, and you can plot some things and so on. And so I don't think there's the best practice. I will say there's some question being raised about the lifespan of information on the web. So, when it's an appendix with a paper, which comes with like a, ISBN number and so on, I think the lifespan of that is quite good. But I'm sure you have all come across, dozens of dead links, URLs, non-active, and so on. So it's really being mindful of where you store the information in a way that it lives as long as you want your work to have influence.
Yes.
So another question that is very interesting also is, what incentives do you think companies, team leaders, funders can introduce to encourage more reproducible work?
Mm-hmm. And so, I spend some of my time working at Facebook. It certainly comes in. There's sort of the two pieces, right? For me, reproducibility is sort of a step towards generalizability. These companies are very interested in having machine learning systems that work. So the incentive of putting in good reproducibility methods in the research means that your ability to transfer those results to application and to real results in the product is much faster. If your research group is always producing results that, don't translate to the product, that's going to be very disappointing. So really the motivation inside the company is towards having faster transition from research to production. When it comes to research groups in a company that publish on the outside, what's the motivation for that? It varies, and we see a big spectrum between all the different companies that publish at a conference by Europe. Some of them are very pro open sourcing, and some of them don't. And there's some companies that are not to open source the work of their researchers, even when they publish in these conferences. I think over time, the researchers have to apply that pressure inside their own companies. They have to get the trust of the leadership to value reproducibility and to value a deep engagement in responsible science.
So I also have a question which kind of, I think, naturally pops out from your talk. So it seems to me that machine learning community would greatly benefit also if we have some standardized way of reporting results, to the point of maybe, even identifying data sets, networks, and so on. We partially do it. So we always look at the papers published a year or two ago to see what is that they are reporting on. But I do also find sometimes published papers where, it seems that the end goal is, okay, we need to be faster, we need to have a better performance, and this is more important than we need to actually fully evaluate, right, the proposed approach, because in the first case, sometimes it boils down to, we need to find a data set and the network on which it works, right? Whereas the second, in the latter case, we more care about, okay, we need to evaluate fully the methodology. And I think that to some extent, I don't know if you agree with me, it requires changing the mentality of machine learning community, because it has been more than one time that I'm sure many of us experienced that our paper got rejected because we are not better enough, not faster enough, and the entire beauty of the actual approach that is being proposed seems to be not important, right? Can you comment more on whether maybe there are some ways, you see some ways to improve that and also change the mentality of our community to be more respectful of the actual methodology rather than just the end result?
I think it's a great call out in terms of, a lot of this is the mindset with which people approach this work. And, one thing I like to talk about is really shifting the mindset of science as a competitive sport, which is this notion of like beating the baseline. And if you don't beat the baseline, you're not a winner and we don't accept your paper. Changing that towards this mentality of like collaborative creation, right? We are collaboratively trying to understand and invent and create the new science and technology. And if you flip to that mindset of much more collaborative creation, then it's kind of a different standard in terms of what are the ways to contribute to that endeavor. And so I think there's a lot that has to be done. At the same time, human incentives and the incentives of the systems in which we work can be quite powerful. And even someone who walks in with a very perhaps idealistic view to change the world through science get caught up in this machine of publishing papers and getting your PhD and tenure and so on. And so one of the things we try to do in the work that I do is come up with like really specific tools that can support that. But like, here's a checklist. It's very specific. It's been adopted by conference like NeurIPS. Some people can, you can just ignore it and check everything, but we're making it easy for you to engage in a meaningful way. And we're not the only ones to do that. There's been a lot of work, there's a interesting concepts of like data sheets for data sets, where you document clearly what's the content of a data set. There's these model cards notion that have also been introduced, where you have sort of a documentation of what your model contains and how it performs and so on. So I mentioned a set of tools here. There are others that can be helpful, but I think just systematically committing to using these tools gives a very concrete framing, whereas changing the mindset is perhaps a little bit more esoterical.
More difficult to approach. So let me read some more questions from the audience. We have quite plenty of them. I'll take a few more before I'll let you rest before your last meeting. So another question is more about the reinforcement learning. So the question is about the future of the research in reinforcement learning. What do you think are the most important questions in reinforcement learning that need to be answered in order to have more real-world applications?
Yeah, I mean, there are many, because reinforcement learning has been used a lot less in practice than supervised learning. Mm-hmm. I'll draw attention to maybe two that I think are crucial. One of them is the question of data efficiency. Almost all of reinforcement learning is done in simulation, where at no cost or almost no cost at all, you can have millions of examples. And that gap from like what we do in simulation to what we do in the real world, when we have orders and orders of magnitude less data, is a big one. And so really thinking carefully of how we do this transfer from simulation. And there's the reality is our simulators are getting better and better. So there's some really promising work at developing more realistic simulators that can get the simulation closer to the real world, but also being thoughtful of how we transfer this to the real world when the data is much, much smaller. And so being smart about how to use small amounts of data, I think, is really important. The second one I will mention is more with respect to safety in reinforcement learning. So there's still a sense that if you learn everything online with reinforcement learning, you can get out of your distribution more easily than in supervised learning. And so really having better methods for doing safe reinforcement learning, I think, will help us be more confident that we can tackle real world application. In most of the case, we see that safety is sort of induced artificially, right? Like in epilepsy, we work with these slice model. At the end of the day, if we do something really dangerous, it's not that costly, but there's a reason we weren't quite ready to move to human models in this case, because I didn't feel confident that we have enough of that safety built into the model. And so I think those are two. There are many others, but those are two that I think are really worth making some progress on.
Another question regarding reproducibility is the following. I'll read it through and I'll just add one more to this. How do you see the reproducibility of those results from big companies based on huge computational resources, which is impossible to be accessible by others? Any way to verify these results? And I will also add another question, I think, which is important, which is that there are some scenarios in which people from academia, for example, cannot reproduce certain results published by companies simply because we don't have access to these computational resources. So we should not be also expected to report such results and papers, obviously. So how to deal with that problem of reproducible in this case, where there is, just some result that somebody published that nobody else really can.
I think it is definitely a constraint, right? There's some work that absolutely needs particular kind of compute infrastructure to be done. And right now the situation is such that the accessibility for that computing infrastructure differs in some cases between whether you're working at a university or in a company. And for people doing certain types of research work, you know, it's to ask specific questions. It's actually much easier to do that work in industry. In some sense, I'm not that concerned about it because I feel there's several companies that have access to that infrastructure. You know, I can think of at least maybe a dozen of them that have access to similar scale infrastructure. So there's no monopoly to who has access to it. Those companies are sort of diverse enough, and we see it, you know, like Google produces a model, 3 weeks later, you know, 3 days later, we're ready to launch it at Facebook, and 3 weeks later, we have the results, and vice versa. You know, we produce a new translation model, like Microsoft takes it over. So that happens quite a bit. The fact that a lot of them are working in open science, I think is really promising. The other thing I'll say is it's not specific to AI, right? There's all sorts of other fields. If you think of physics, people who are doing, you know, particular experiments in physics, not every university has their infrastructure. The method they've adopted is to have common infrastructure. So some of the, you know, particle accelerators and so on are common infrastructure where people do the work together. We have seen some of that for computation also. In Canada, we have a whole, you know, cluster called Compute Canada that we have access to as university researchers. And so we may need more of these national or international level consortiums of computation to open it up. But I do think also it's okay that not everyone in their, you know, in their home can do all of the same experiments, and you should pick experiments for which you have both the expertise but also the right tooling.
I will wrap up with the last question from the audience, a little bit more in a different kind of in a different flavor. How can we motivate students at early stages, for example, undergraduate students, I would also maybe add high school students, to utilize research in their projects?
I think research is almost like a mindset, right? And so it's this mindset of asking questions and wanting to dig in. So I think it's the kind of thing that you can do at any stage and in any field that mindset transfers. So I think it's the, you know, at the high school level, it's about giving questions, whether you're teaching math or physics, giving questions where there's not a single answer and not forcing everyone to come up with the same answer all the time, right? Having some open-ended questions where people are, you know, invited to engage in the complexity of it and in finding their own path through that. So I think that mindset can be done as early as elementary school, and the complexity changes over time. When you get to an undergrad level, you know, I always recommend the undergrad to try to do a summer research position in a lab, but also do like an industry position and kind of do a bit of both through your undergrad degree, so you can get a taste of that, and maybe do research in different labs in different disciplines to get a sense of that. Especially for those who are studying computer science now, there's so many possibilities to do a research position in neuroscience, biology, even like linguistics and so on. It's very, very open. That set of skills that you have opens up so many different research opportunities.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joelle, for joining the talk. There are plenty more questions, but maybe I'll let you rest a little bit because you've been with us since 8 a.m. So again, thank you so much for a very inspiring, wonderful talk. And you will have one more meeting in 15 minutes, the closing meeting with our faculty. Thank you so much again, and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and being with us today. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you soon.